president of the old Wye Mill, and we're here in Queen Anne's County, just on the border of Queen Anne's and Talbot County on the eastern shore of Maryland. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Carla, for coming here and thinking about old Wye Mill. As Carla stated, I am John Nizer. I'm the president of the Friends of Wye Mill Incorporated. We're a nonprofit organization. My background is I'm retired from Verizon and also had 32 years in the Maryland Army National Guard. The old Wye Mill, the Friends of Wye Mill assumed operation of this mill somewhere in 1990, 1991, when they were formed by a group of local citizens who wanted to preserve the mill. At that time, the mill was owned by the state of Maryland. The state of Maryland gave the ownership of the mill to Preservation Maryland. And in 1996, Preservation Maryland transferred the grist mill and 3/4 of an acre to the Friends of Wye Mill. So we took sole custody of the mill at that time. We are open from the May through mid-November, and we grind grain on the first and third Saturdays of each month during that period of time.
But John, you aren't open if it's really hot or really cold, and today is really hot.
And because it gets really cold in here, that's why we close in mid-November.
And how old is this building?
This building dates back to 1682, so it's over 336 years old.
Wow. And we're considered the grain that came here, the grain that was milled here is now, you said, we were the breadbasket of the country at the time. Is that correct?
Yes. During the 1700s, the Eastern Shore was known as the breadbasket of the Revolutionary War.
Wow.
There were hundreds of small mills like ours dating back then. However, many of them became loyal to the king because they owned their property because of grants from the king.
Interesting.
This mill was owned by Colonel William Hensley during the Revolutionary War. A little background about Colonel William Hensley. During the Revolution War, as I stated, the mill was owned by Colonel William Hensley, commander of Queen Anne's County Militia. Hemsley represented Maryland in the Continental Congress in 1782 and 1783. Hemsley was a member of the convention that ratified the United States the United States Constitution in 1788. In October of 1779, Colonel William Hensley received a letter from the Maryland Council in Annapolis asking him to supply flour and grain to George Washington's army.
Aww.
And he did so starting in 1780.
And I want to say...
And he did that throughout the war until the war was over.
John, I want to say to our listeners that where we're located, it's across from Annapolis, and President Washington, well, at the time he wasn't president, I guess, but his place was in Mount Vernon. That's where he lived. So we're not that far away from Virginia.
That is correct.
So this was a perfect location for them to get the grain as long as they took it across the Chesapeake Bay. Is that right?
That's correct. Small flat-bottom boats would come down. There was a creek to the north side of the mill. Flat-bottom boats would come down there to a landing. They would be loaded with barrels and bags of flours and grain that was ground in the mill. Then it was taken back on the west side of the mill. Beyond the trees that you can't see today is the Wye East River. So that stream would go down to the Wye East River and large ships would come into what was known as Emerson Landing, which is right up the road from the mill. Today we call it Wye Landing. Back then, during the Revolutionary War, it was Wye Landing. And then the ships would be loaded from the small flat bottom boats, and it would go all over the world. You go up to Boston, go down to Virginia, New Orleans, and the flour was taken everywhere. However, during the Revolutionary War, when Colonel Hemsley committed to provide grain to Washington's army, it would go up to the military warehouse, which was up at the head of Elk,
the Elk
northern
River?
part of the Chesapeake Bay. Today, the head of Elk is known as Elkton, Maryland.
Huh. And we're talking about the why. Well, let's talk about the water, how the miller would dam the water so that you would have the pressure needed to operate the wheel.
Well, before the miller can actually start grinding grain, he has several chores to do, shall we say. First, he goes down to the lower level of the mill and where the gears are connected to the water wheel. He's got to pound down wooden teeth that make up a gear in order to turn the running stone to grind the grain. Once they are all tapped down and locked into place, then he would go across the road, at that time a dirt road naturally, go across the road, and he would open up the gate to the mill pond. The mill pond's it's a natural pond fed by spring waters, and it's over 50 acres.
But did they build that pond? When you say it's a natural pond, what does that mean?
It was there.
It was there.
Yeah.
Wow.
God put it there.
Oh, so they
And
picked this place to have the
All they
mill.
did is put a little dam to it and put a gate on it, so the water so he could stop the water from flowing down. And he controlled when he wanted the water to flow down to go to the water mill itself, the water wheel itself. And then he would then open up that gate and engage the water wheel, and all the gears would start turning and the stones would start turning.
John, could you tell us how the mill became automated?
Oliver Evans from Delaware was a self-taught man, and at the time around 1783 or a little before, he automated the mills. Prior to that time, milling was done by a mill our size might have 6 to 8 people running it, most of them young boys indentured by the family to the miller to get a job and educate them how to be millers. Automated mills, Oliver Evans took the water wheel and connected belts and wheels to it, and the belts are all actually operating a small elevator. So when the miller would put the grain down a chute, it would go into the elevator shaft, and the grain would be picked up automatically by the water wheel operation, taken to the upper floor where it went through a cornmeal bin, as we call it, and it dried out the grain. Then it came down the chute and fed into the stones where the grain was ground up. Once it was ground up, the chaff, let's talk about corn, the corn kernel was ground up, the chaff and the cornmeal would go downstairs through a chute, be picked up by another elevator, taken up to a bolter that had, at that time, cloth screening. Today we use regular screening. And what that does is separate the actual cornmeal itself from the chaff. The cornmeal goes into what we call the meal bin, where it's taken out, put in bags, weighed, and then we sell. That's how we get some money to operate the mill. We sell our grain. And then the chaff would go into another container, whether it be a bag or a barrel, and then the miller could sift through that with fine screening and get grits. Grits come from part of the corn that doesn't get ground up during the grinding mechanism. So he could sell grits, or he could sell the food, the chaff itself, for food for animals. Of course, if he's really desperate, he would try to regrind it and get another pound or two of flour. But Oliver Evans invented that. Oliver Evans.
And he was from the Eastern Shore?
He was from Delaware.
Oh, okay.
And at the time when he invented the automated milling system, as it's called, he was living in Tuckahoe. I think it's part of the Tuckahoe State Park now.
Oh, neat.
Evans is called the father of American inventors. He received Maryland patent in 1787 for his automated system. In 1790, Evans received the third U.S. federal patent.
Number 3. I wonder what number 1 and 2 were.
In 1795, Evans published a book named The Young Millwright and Miller's Guide.
Aww.
And since that time, there were 15 editions from 1795 to 1860.
Yay, Oliver.
Yes. There are several things connected with milling, phrases that you hear. For instance, if you ever heard somebody say, keep your nose to the grindstone, okay? The miller, it came from milling because the miller would have to put his nose down to the grindstones because if he got a funny odor like burning, he knew that he had his stones too close together. They were mashing the grain, not grinding the grain up.
Cool.
There's another one called milling around. When the farmer brought his grain to the miller, they would barter back and forth. The miller would want a certain percentage of what he ground because that's his pay for grinding your grain. Then he has the option of feeding his family or selling it. Once the bartering was done, then the miller would start grinding the grain. You, the farmer, knowing that your grain is better than your neighbor's, would hang around the mill and talk about life in the community. What's going on? There's no phones, there's no TV or radio. So you have to say, hey, Bill, what's going on in your neck of the county? I don't know what's going on down over here.
So we're just milling around.
You got it. That's where that comes from. You're milling around. Another one is show me your metal, and it's METTLE. And that means that if your stones get worn out after a while, and they have to be dressed, and they're dressed by sharpening the lands and grooves, just like the inside of a rifle. You have lands and grooves. The stones have land and grooves. So a millwright would a miller would hire a millwright to dress his stones and make them sharp. But before he did that, he says, "Show me your metal." The millwright would pull up his sleeves and show him his arms, and if his arms were full of marks and little scars, then the miller knew this guy must be pretty good.
Oh my gosh.
Because his arms are messed up, because they get messed up from hammer and chisel, the stones and little flakes flying off and nicking his arms. If you saw John Iser's arms, he said, "No, I don't want you, don't want you dressing my stones." So that's just some of the things that go on with the different terminology, things we hear today, little cliches.
Well, John, let's talk about the turn, I guess, of the 17th going into the 18th century, in that we grew tobacco down here, and that was a cash crop to then sell to the, well, in fact, it was cash, wasn't it? Used
tobacco was good as gold.
Yeah.
They bought property with tons of tobacco.
Yeah. But
that was in the 1600s.
Okay.
Beginning around 1630. Now in the 1700s, because of the Revolutionary War, it started growing corn and wheat and other grains. And that's how we supplied George Washington's army with that kind of stuff. The Eastern Shore was known as the breadbasket of the Revolutionary War. I think I mentioned that before. Then later on, different grains started taking place, different products and commodities, whether it be grain or chickens or fruit later on. But during that period of time, it was corn and wheat in the 1800s.
So when mostly, I guess they were men, maybe women came, I don't know, by wagon to drop off their grain. How quickly could they turn that around? Was it, I'll drop it off today and we'll come back tomorrow, or what?
Well, depending on how busy the miller was, and how much grain how many pounds of grain you bring in, hundreds of pounds of grain, you could do 100 pounds of grain in a few hours.
But he had to probably store the grain someplace. Where did he store it?
When he got the corn, if the corn was on the cob, then he would have to remove the corn from the cob.
He would do that?
He would do that.
Uh-huh.
Normally the farmer would have a machine at his property that he would get it off. But not everybody had that kind of money to buy a machine like that where you put the corn cob in, crank a handle, and it separates the corn from the cob. So the miller may have to do that. And if he couldn't grind the grain that particular day, he would have storage bins around the property.
Uh-huh.
So the corn would be mounted up in there and just stored in there until he can grind it.
And then we're talking about feeding both livestock and human beings, right?
Yes, when the farmer gave his grain to the miller and the miller ground the grain, there's machinery in the mill that would separate the actual corn. Let's talk about corn. It would actually separate the corn meal from the chaff. Now, since the miller now owns the chaff, that's his property, he could either try to regrind it to get another couple pounds of flour, or he could sift it down to get grits, which is a part of the corn kernel that it was not ground up. That's what grits are. He could also sell it back to the farmer to feed his stock.
Huh.
So even though the farmer gave him the grain, you would think, well, that stuff is still mine property. When he bartered with the miller owned it, and he could sell it back to the farmer to feed his livestock.
Oh, very interesting. That would take a lot of time just to figure that out, wouldn't it?
I guess it would.
Oh my gosh. Okay, let's get back to the Hemsleys, because they're an interesting family, and they've got some property that they've just bought close by. So would you like to tell us about them, please?
The Hemsley family started a foundation. The property had several names, but Colonel William Hensley, during the Revolutionary War, when he owned it, he called the property Cloverfield. And the Cloverfield Preservation Foundation, which was started by the Hemsleys family up in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, they have purchased the Hemsley Plantation House. And he purchased that in 2018. Interesting enough, only 3 families have owned that house. The house was built by Philemon Hemsley in 1705. The Hemsley family owned it. Then it was turned over to, I think it was the Formans, who were relatives of the Hemsleys.
Oh.
And then they sold it to
The current owners.
the current owners, whose
Right.
name just left me, Callahans. They bought it from the Callahan family. So all these years, from 1705
Amazing.
to 2018, only 3 families have owned
That's
that property.
amazing. And let's talk about the other historic properties contiguous with your property.
Well, not too far from the mill itself is a house that was built by one of the Hemsleys family members. Locally, it's known as the Miller's House. It's a brick home that was built somewhere in the 1700s, and that house currently was purchased this year, beginning of this year, by the Cloverfield Preservation Foundation. Right now it's just all closed up, being protected, while they continue to work on the plantation house and clover fields. When that is done, then they're going to start renovating the miller's house.
And we would be remiss if we didn't at least talk about the Wye Oak, which is no longer extant, I guess, but the importance of the Wye Oak in this area as well.
Well, when a Wye Oak tree was still up, it was at the time, it was the oldest oak tree in the United States.
Wow.
In 2002, a storm came and wiped out the oak tree, unfortunately. There's a new tree planted in its place. That tree that's growing up there now is actually a sapling from the original Wye Oak tree. And the state of Maryland has made it a park, a state park. And there's a pavilion up there that has a large slice of what the interior of the tree looked like.
Oh, cool.
And other parts of the tree were used to make a desk for the governor of the state of Maryland's office.
And I
Up
would,
the church from the tree is the Wye Parish Church. Dates back to 1721.
yep.
There were not a lot of roads for people to travel on at that period of time in the colonial era. However, there was a lot of water, so people came to that church by water. They still have a dock up there today.
Huh.
You can't come by water anymore, but historically they have preserved this site with the dock on it.
Well, John, talking about the historic things that you have here at the mill, could you tell us what you recently got in the way of grant money to preserve some of the artifacts that you have here at the mill?
Yes. My wife's cousin, Mr. Robert Zimmerman of Baltimore, has been associated with the Baltimore Museum of Art and also Walther's Art Museum. He happened to come in the mill one day because he kept on hearing me talk about it, and then he saw these bags, push pins, stapled, nailed, taped up on a wall, and he was horrified. Especially when he saw one that a squirrel was locked in here over the winter time and started feeding off the bags. So we took all the bags down. Robert took them, and Robert and I met with a group of women called the Queen Anne's Homemakers group. And out of that group of about 60 women, we had about 5 women that helped us. I didn't do anything. Helped us sew the bags onto a muslin frame, and then that frame was put inside another frame to protect it from dust and sun rays. And today, you come into the mill, you see all these wonderful frame bags being preserved that were donated to the mill somewhere in the 1980s, a private collection of one of the millers that was hired by the state of Maryland when they were running the mill. This mill was purchased from the last miller was Mr. Winford Blakesley. And Mr. Blakesley could not compete with Baltimore once the Bay Bridge opened up.
What do you mean he couldn't compete?
Well, at the time, when he bought the mill in 1918, and he ran the mill commercially up until the Bay Bridge opened.
Oh my gosh.
Because, he's on the eastern shore. You only had ferry boats bringing people from what we call the western shore over, out of Annapolis. So he sold his grain all up Philadelphia, Boston.
Oh, neat.
All around down Virginia. However, when the bridge opened, then all the mills in Baltimore trucked stuff over, and they could compete because they were larger. He was just an old small mill, and so he decided at the age of 76 he was going to retire. So state of Maryland wanted his mill pond, which is on the eastern side of our mill across the road, and they wanted it to stock fish and for fishing. So at the time, he sold it to them. They took charge of it, and he retired.
Cool. So the Preservation Maryland has helped you all out as well, haven't they?
Yes, and I think in the beginning I stated that they gave us ownership of the mill in 1996. And in the year 2013, we were recipients of the Preservation Maryland Historic Sites Stewardship Award for the way we handled our funds, and we were good stewards of all the donations that we get from our membership.
Wonderful, John. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and this is a real treasure, a real treasure, and we just encourage everyone on their way to the beach or just want to come moseying by and seeing Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad to come here and see your mill.
Yes, we're open during a week from 10 to 4. As I mentioned before, we grind grain the first and third Saturdays of each month from May through mid-November. And on weekends, other than grinding, sometimes we don't have enough volunteers to have the mill open. We try. But if you're going to come down and it's not the first or third Saturday, give us a call and make sure we have a volunteer that's working at the mill.
Oh, nice.
And thanks for coming back.